So Europe. Uh, Probably some people have been to Europe. Anyone been to Europe at all ever? No? Where in Europe?
Amsterdam.
Amsterdam. Amsterdam is a lovely place. Lovely place. Very often when I go to Europe, I'll go. You go, cheap flights through Amsterdam. You could just kind of spend an extra day or so in a place that you're flying in and out of. These lines were chaotic this summer. I actually traveled to Europe this summer. Hadn't planned on it. Well, I had planned on it a long time ago about my tickets and everything. And then the airline sent us an email saying that because of COVID and changes, if I wanted to cancel and get my money back, I could. So my wife and I canceled the trip. And then we kept on checking with them about refunding the money. And they kept on saying things were processing, it would just take a little bit longer. And finally, about 2 weeks before the trip was supposed to happen, my wife spent kind of all day on the phone and found out that the trip was never canceled and that we were just going to lose our money if we didn't go. So we're like, well, let's just see how much traveling sucks during a pandemic. And it's difficult. It's difficult. I still recommend travel as a great thing to do. Many places in Europe have very high vaccination rates. But they do a lot of, well, you guys all know at this point what contact tracing is, right? Anytime we would go in between countries, we'd have to fill out a bunch of paperwork. We'd have to figure out what our address was of the hotels that we'd be at and all this contact tracing information, just kind of again and again and again. So, not the most fun, but it was still good to travel. These lines were really long this year. I would say there was one time in Portugal was that these exact lines with these exact names stood in place for 3 hours without moving. So it was slow sometimes. All right, jumping off into our reading. Europe, right? Usually a place that people think of as its own continent, even though from a geographical perspective, well, you have Eurasia as a continent, right? Europe isn't actually distinctly cut off from the rest of Eurasia, although in the kind of mindset that Europeans set up, it was, right? They wanted to divide the world into these kind of 3 categories, just as a simple way of thinking about the world. But also, strangely enough, it lined up with Europeans' conception of the world, specifically in a number of different ways. One, putting themselves on top. Also, if you remember from the readings, trying for whatever reason to say the world was in the shape of a cross. A lot of, Roman Catholicism was the rule of the day in the Middle Ages. And a lot of people in Europe took such things like a map like this that doesn't really make a lot of sense, but took it as gospel reality, right? Even to the point when making actual maps of the region, they would try to squish things around as much as possible, even as new information was coming about the shape of the world. So for example, there's not an actual circular ocean that surrounds this whole area, right? It's like it's around Earth, but there isn't an endless ocean. So it's one of those weird things of history that still kind of has a legacy in that Europe is still often thought of as its own continent that is separate from the rest of the world, right? Europe separated from Africa, from Asia, but it's actually completely connected to Asia. Through time, as I said, even when new knowledge was coming about how the rest of the world was shaped, and things were getting, more and more information was coming, especially after the Dark Ages, from, a lot of centers of knowledge that were in the rest of the world about the shape of the world. Europeans' knowledge of the actual shape of the world starting to evolve, starting to change. As I mentioned, having Atina own the map was really forced into place. Yeah. Physical geography of Europe. Well, let me just get to a picture of the actual continent. So as you can see, right, very connected to the rest of the world. Let's see here, what can I say about this? Well, note the plate boundary that goes through Italy and also Turkey. This plate boundary, well, like many of these plate boundaries around the world, there's a lot of earthquakes, there's a lot of volcanoes. Europe itself, if it wasn't for the Atlantic drift bringing warm water from off the coast of Africa, Europe would actually be much colder than it otherwise is. If you ever look at a globe, for example, and line up how far north and south Europe is compared to, say, Minnesota, you'll notice this a lot, this striking difference in temperatures. But also what this has made for the climate of Europe is it's made it a much more moderate climate without a lot of extremes. Now, the further into the continent you go, the more extremes you have. And of course, our next chapter is taking us further in. Although, as I'm sure you noticed, this chapter talks a lot about Eastern Europe, and then our next chapter that is supposed to be about Eastern Europe talks a lot about Western Europe. But that just shows you how interconnected the whole area is. Let's see, what else can I tell you here? I think that's it about this one. A larger picture of these plate boundaries. And we've talked about a lot of these as we have covered the different areas through time. This is yet another example of if we're talking about continents and if we're dividing them up like using plates and plate tectonics, you have a Eurasian plate, right? Not a European plate that's different from an Asian plate, Eurasian. Another map from the book looking at specific tectonic activity. Well, it's actually a lot of this, specifically the volcanoes in Italy, that led a lot of people to believe, to figure out things like the age of the Earth, right? Because, Mount Etna had been putting out a steady amount of lava throughout the years, and a number of scholars, they added up, Mount Etna puts out this much volcanic lava per year, and then you add up how big the mountain is. And then what is more, looking under areas of the mountain and finding fossils, you can then date those fossils, right? And so a lot of the fact that this is along this boundary helped with that kind of knowledge. So it's not just a destructive force, although it is obviously a very actually destructive force. Similar to other areas of the world that we looked at when it comes to damage from earthquakes, very often places that have kind of new building codes tend to have less damage and less deaths. But of course, less places that have historical buildings. Of course, when those buildings were put in, there weren't such things as building codes. So a lot of historical places can have lots of ruins. And in Italy, every year or two, you'll see some often gorgeous old buildings that have been destroyed from earthquakes. Still happens all the time. Pompeii, kind of one of the most famous volcanic eruptions, again in Italy. Let's see, I don't suppose, of course, not that many students this year have traveled that much. I suppose it's probably due to the pandemic. People maybe read about Pompeii. Maybe you've seen depictions of little figures like this when it comes to volcanoes. Is this familiar to anybody? Like if you're reading a news article about volcanoes? Do you know what this is?
That's Mount Vesuvius, when erupted. That's erupted in different versions, and this one version was it put ash on everybody. And so this is a version of all those people who was praying to a higher power while they died.
Yes. They could have also been trying to breathe, maybe. It's it, it's interesting because, well, as you say, there were different types of eruptions and different kind of things that happened. And there's still like Pompeii was on the news just this week because they found what had been a slave quarters. Well, what this is, if you have a lot of volcanic ash covering up, well, let's back up. When they first started kind of digging up this area and trying to figure out what it is, there had been stories written about volcanic eruption and whatnot. And when people were digging, well, obviously sometimes you find skeletons and stuff, right? Sometimes you find just these empty spaces that there's nothing in them. And people hypothesized through time that it was possible that if organic material was covered in this ash, it could be just completely desiccated and waste away, and it would just leave these kind of empty pockets. And so what they did was, when they were kind of excavating, if they did find one of these empty pockets, they would fill it full of plaster, right? Dump a bunch of plaster in there, let it settle, and then you take it out just to see what shape it is. And sometimes it's like a horse and different organic things, but sometimes, people are organic things as well. And so that's what these are about. And like I said, they're still finding these today. Like just last week. This isn't from the news though. This is when I went in college. Went to Italy. This is an old auditorium. Well, is it an auditorium? One of the interesting things about Pompeii is it was for the time, very modern city. This is just streets. And these are all had to be excavated. These were all under a lot of volcanic ash, not lava, because as you can imagine, lava would be much more difficult to excavate through. There's lots of these little figures. Oh, it's a little dark.
I have a question.
Yeah.
Why did they decide to build Napoli right by Pompeii? Because it's literally built on the same volcano that erupted and killed millions of people. So why would they want to do that again?
Couple different reasons. One being actually areas where tectonic plates come together often have really valuable metals because the metals are heated up and they kind of leak through, and so there's lots of money to be made. And also there's just a thing happens where people don't think something's going to happen to them, right? They think something's going to happen to everybody else, but it won't happen to them, right? It's like, oh, this thing we're talking about, it's not going to happen in my city, right? There was that kind of an attitude. And enough time goes by sometimes that they're just minor eruptions that they think it's not going to be a gigantic one that kills the whole city. And they would be wrong, right? Just some more excavated areas. And again, looks not dissimilar from more modern day homes. This is my college roommate. But he's just standing here to give this some scale. This was the equivalent of fast food at the time. They would have these fires under here. You'd have pots. You'd have some water. This is a little street here. People would come up and purchase their food. All right, a little bit of Pompeii. Back to geography in this chapter. Well, as I said before, when we're talking about Europe as a region, not as a separate continent, because again, it's connected, but as a region, that makes some distinctive amount of sense, right? Because culturally, it's a place that has more interaction locally, right? Although there's lots of connections with the rest of the world, obviously. I was mentioning the climate earlier. You can see some areas here that have some polar climates. These are also areas that when there have been ice ages, this is where the glaciers built up and spilled across from. Let's see, what else can I point out from here? Like I said, the climates are much more moderated than they would otherwise be because there's so much water is a very moderating influence to climate and weather, and this is such a large peninsula, right? This is another map from the book, looking at, if you're going to try to define Europe, looking at the categories of language, religion, and race, what would you have? Well, again, you see Europe is very connected to all the rest of Asia, right? Going all the way to the coast here, and this is Japan just for reference, right? Do people know why this cultural trait extends right along here? Anything else going on in this area?
Oh, that is, isn't that like a migration? It looks like the Mongolian migration pattern. Not just that, but it looks like a very big, like, all the way back to the Ice Age. It looks like a pattern that people took to Europe.
That's a fair guess, but the reason these have these strong European traits isn't because of a movement this way. It was because of movement this way. The Soviet Union used to ship out political dissidents to this area. And this area here is all along the border of China. And if you remember us talking about buffer states, could anyone define a buffer state?
A buffer state is like a state that is part of a culture, but not particularly part of the statehood of a certain region.
What is the purpose of a buffer state?
To act as an in-between.
Well, it's basically you have a powerful, maybe an empire or a country, right? And let's say you have another powerful country that's right beside it, right? And if their borders are along each other, you're really nervous that the other country, if they wanted to invade, they have their military right there on the border anyway. It'd be very quick and easy for them to evade. So what often places will do is they'll create a border state. They'll say something like, actually, this little country, this little area that's in between us, we're just going to decide, there's a king there, and that person is in charge of that area, so that if there's an invasion, we'll see that country invade them first, and then we could get ready for when they get to us.
So Mongolia.
Mongolia.
Kazakhstan, Tajikistan, everything.
Yeah, those are good examples of buffer states. And that's, all along here. And the Soviet Union was trying to basically make another, they didn't want to have this area not have people from Russia, right? This is part of the larger Russification. Russification. That's actually a term that doesn't come up into the next chapter, but I'm going to describe it anyway because it comes up and it's relevant. Russification is a term for something that all empires did. Russification was, right, you have the Soviet Union, a whole bunch of different countries, different languages, different ethnicities, right? But Russia is in charge and in control. Well, what they did was, places that they had, that they were in charge and control of, they wanted those places to, speak Russian, right? And take on Russian values. So imperialism isn't just about economic and taking over an area and taking their resources, but it's usually about, it's a cultural thing. It's about getting rid of those other cultures completely. People ever study history heard of Prussia?
Mm-hmm.
Prussia?
Yes.
Where is Prussia?
Germany. I mean, it's technically like in between of Germany and Russia. So like Catherine the Great was from Prussia, right? One of the biggest monarchs of Russia.
Yes. And Prussia itself is gone, right? What happened, you had Germanization. Germany took over the area and then it was like, okay, you need to study German now. You need to know German. You need to do German clothes and dances. No more of this Prussia stuff. Because German is better. We think so because we're Germans. That's what happened to Prussia. So they're gone.
The Germans have a habit of doing that, don't they?
All empires do it. The Mongolian Empire did it. the Russians. Empires, that's one of the things they do. Again, it's not just economic, it's not just power and taking over places and taking the resources, but making those places copy their culture that they have defined as being superior, right? All right. European Union. So it's not coincidentally right after the Second World War. There was a feeling that, well, if Europe was interconnected and they were economically and culturally all connected, maybe they'd be less likely to go to war against each other so readily as they had been so often in the past, right? And it started out with a small group of nations, but has expanded through time. If you remember from the video I showed you, lots of areas that were Eastern Europe have now become part of the European Union, and many other places want to be part of the European Union. Before the European Union, let me give you some examples about how it's helped. When I would go on a tour to Europe, every single little border that you'd go across, you're trying to go on a drive, and as you go on down a road, there might be borders that come back and forth. You would have to have someone check all of your papers, and sometimes they would turn you away. And every different country you go into, like let's say you just wanted to plug in a device you brought, right? Every country would have a different type of plug with a different type of thing, so you'd have to get an adapter. I would have a bag of adapters just to plug in an alarm clock.
They don't like each other. Like I noticed that too. Like everywhere you go, it's very. So Amsterdam, for example, right? One of the craziest things that ever happened to me was I was on a trip from East Africa to Amsterdam to the United States. When I got to Amsterdam, I had a layover, and so with regards to that layover, I remember I had like a council member like the United States come to me. Why are you here? What are you doing here? Where did you come from? Basically, actually, my whole life story. But one thing I noticed like throughout Europe is just the alienation. Once you go to the UK, it's a completely different story, especially right now with regards to their tensions within Europe. And it's like these people. It's in a lot of ways, it's like the Dark Ages never ended. But they still have that animosity, cultural animosity.
Yeah, it's one of those things where the different countries will have these old kind of battles, right, that are of previous generations that in some ways new generations will try to move on from. Like there's plenty of people who consider the European Union to be the future and to think of themselves as a European rather than a specific German or a different country, right? But then you have plenty of people who hate all that. And they think that their culture is vastly superior to others, and they actively dislike even others within their own country. That if we were visiting, if you visit Germany, for example, like you go to one region and it may seem very similar to the next, right? Like the customs are just slightly different, the accents are just slightly different. But within the country, often they'll have huge animosities between each other, among peoples that we can't even really tell the difference between. I'm a geographer who studies cultures, and I'll go to places, I'll be like, I had no idea that this is a different type of people over here than this over here. It all seems similar to...
For example, in Germany, like Bavaria, like the whole Eastern thing versus the Western, like Frankfurt, all of those places, they hate each other. They literally, like, in the 80s and 90s, during soccer games, they literally used to kill each other.
Oh, yeah.
And now it's kind of like, okay, yeah, we're so progressive and we're wonderful, this, that, but we hate those motherfuckers. Yeah.
Well, and it depends on which ones, though, right? Again, like I said, there are plenty of people who have decided they're a new generation, they want to move on, they're like other Europeans, and then there's plenty of people who don't, right? The ratio of those types of people in the countries, it might be like 50-50. And so when you're running around and you meet people, you'll meet lots of different types. Let's see, European Union. Oh, let me just finish up on this subtopic. So after the European came together, right, it was mostly an economic union at first, but this made it so that, like, let's say you just wanted to have start up a light bulb company, right? And well, you just want to have a standard for like the socket that you're going to put a light bulb in and be able to sell it to different countries. Well, they started standardizing these things so you would have the whole European market instead of just a small country. For travelers, it's much easier to just kind of go around and around to different countries than it used to be, right? You don't have to check your passports and go through a big thing. So map of the European Union, we see a lot going on here. These are different years that the different countries became parts of the European Union. You'll notice some countries that are not part. Norway, right? Now, Norway is definitely like in Europe. Does anyone know why Norway would not want to be in the European Union?
Because, well, first things first, they are kind of the border, especially right now, between Europe and Russia. And there's kind of a conflict between them, like Europe and Russia, Western Europe and Eastern Europe, or Western Europe and like ideological.
That's all true, but Norway doesn't really have too much part of that stuff. It's more money. Oh, sure.
They want to have control over the oil.
Yeah, a whole bunch of oil has been found in the North Sea here, right? Now, when you're part of the European Union, it's just like, if you're a state within the United States, you're paying taxes, you're paying federal taxes, right? There's lots of states who have a bit of an attitude of like, well, all that money should stay in my state because it's going to all these other states that are, I don't know what's going on in those states, right? And if you have countries, they have even more of that kind of a feeling. So Norway spends, if you remember different countries that were having trouble with their birth rates, so they want to put in a lot of benefits to people to have kids, that stuff costs money. Norway actually has a real great social safety net for all kinds of different things, retirement, having kids, you name it. And part of the reason is because they have all this oil money. If they became part of the European Union, they'd have to share that around more, right? Switzerland, also not part of the European Union. Why would that be? Why would Switzerland? There's a few different reasons.
Neutrality?
What's that?
Neutral.
They have historically said that they're neutral in different things, in wars and whatnot. But there's a bit of a reason why they stress that neutrality.
I mean, they're in the mountains, no one can really reach them. So like, why not? If I'm above everybody and I see everything going to shit below me, and I'm gonna stay where I am, I'm not really gonna go out of my way to come down.
Is there a way for them to make money on their neutrality?
United Nations?
We're talking before that.
They're a safe haven for people who store their money. They'll take in money from anyone.
Swiss bank accounts, right? You probably heard of that term used sometimes. It's like, oh, secret Swiss bank accounts. If they became part of the European Union, their businesses would then be under European regulations. Those European regulations would be like, oh, well, let's take a look at these bank accounts and just see what's happening. Where's this money coming from? It's like, oh, drug lords in different areas of the world, right? Old Nazi money, a huge range of money that are in secret bank accounts that Switzerland doesn't really want people prying their eyes into, right, and checking out. They want all that stuff to be just kind of kept their little secret.
So it's a criminal's paradise.
Yeah.
It's like Tortugas from back in the day, like the Caribbean, the pirates.
Have you read about the Panama Papers?
Mm-hmm.
All right, Panama Papers. Won't go into it, but yeah, there's a lot of illegal money that's being stored in places, laundered, as they say. Switzerland. See if there's any other country of note. No, that's pretty good. Oh, we talked about buffer. Oh, actually, I will mention Belgium is a classic case of a buffer state. Belgium should just technically be part of France, but it's a buffer state. It was created just so if either country invaded this way, they'd have countries in their way, right? Now, Belgium is actually, this has been a bit of a benefit to Belgium in modern day because when they were looking for where would the capital of the European Union be, there are plenty of countries that wanted it to be within their country. But if you have the entire European Union, let's say you decided the capital was going to be France, well, then everything has a very French kind of, it's almost like France was the capital of Europe in a way, right? So if they picked Belgium, which is a smaller country, had a lot less damage after Second World War. Their economy was kind of more together. Lots of things going for Belgium, and that's why Brussels is where the capital of the European Union is.
Didn't Donald Trump say that it was hell?
That it was what?
He said it was like a hell cluster.
Oh, Belgium? Wow, their waffles are delicious. So, Brexit, countries can vote to leave the European Union. Like, they're not forced to be in it. And so when political winds sway, or if you have a vote where not that many people show up to the vote, a vote is very close, but it could be something that really completely changes the economy of a place. Brexit is the term used for when the UK voted to leave. Cold War in Europe. So after the video I showed you talked a lot about this, right? The Warsaw Pact versus NATO. The video I showed you talked a lot about NATO, did not talk that much about the Warsaw Pact. But the Warsaw Pact was all of these different countries that were under Russian control. Yeah.
So what's the difference between a Cold War and a hot war?
Well, that's a good question. Cold War, that meant that, well, there wasn't specific military live action going on. But they had plenty of proxy wars blowing up the rest of the world. If you watch any like James Bond movies, you'll see a lot of stuff about that. Well, and the thing was the Soviet Union tried to paint this as these being different countries that were independent, but were all part of a big happy union. But these countries were not part of that by choice. At the end of the Second World War, there was a bit of a mad dash between the different sides that were the winners, right? And this is basically where they came together. Some of these were agreed upon beforehand. There were areas of Germany that the East and West agreed that, well, this is where our troops are going to meet up and this is where the new borders are going to be. But a lot of it was a bit of a happenstance and kind of what happened in different areas. Second World War is a real interesting thing, right? Because it was this fight to defeat fascism, right? Does anyone remember what the fascist countries were in Europe?
Italy, Japan.
In Germany.
Yeah, Germany.
Any other countries were fascist? Yeah.
Wasn't Bulgaria's leader fascist for a while?
Yeah.
Hey, who else? Wasn't there, oh god, wasn't Romania's leader fascist for a while?
Well,
I don't remember who else, to be honest.
But that's the thing though, like, sometimes I just kind of, like with regards to history and world politics, and it's like some countries are just like the biggest biters. You know what I mean by biter? Like, like, for example, Romania. Like, really, who gives a damn if Transylvania is fascist or socialist?
People who live there?
I mean, sure, but like, what, like 133,000 people who, not particularly, but like, you understand what I'm saying? In the grand scheme of things, it's just like, it's kind of like Australia, It's annoying when people go out of their way to be something that they don't have to be. Does that make sense? For example, look at the alliance with the United States and the alliance that just happened the other day. The United States, the UK, and Australia, right? And now Australia is in a trade war with China. Even though if China decides to make a decisive step with regards to anything, with regards to Taiwan or with regards to anything, then the closest person in proximity is Australia. So it's kind of like sometimes it's just ties. Why? Because you have colonial ties to the UK, because you have ties to the United States. But then again, you think about it, and it's like, okay, the UK used to send everyone who was a criminal to Australia. So really, like, do you have ties to it, or did they just treat you as criminals and expel you to somewhere where they thought it was uninhabitable, you know? And you guys survived. So it's really
Well,
weird.
not to get too much on a tangent on Australia, because we'll cover Australia in a couple of chapters, but I will really quickly say that it's interesting because there's a lot of people in modern day Australia who feel that way. They're like, my heritage is from, England, but what does that have to do with the price of bread?
Exactly, but
Right.
when your parents when your great grandparents tried to steal bread because they were starving to death, they were sent somewhere where it was worse than them for them to be in Europe. But you still have a sense of alliance. It's just stupid. Like sometimes the things that people are politically motivated towards is just dumb.
Well, let me backtrack to Europe real quick and give an example of when we were talking about what other countries were fascist and what weren't and what effect does that have on the world. If you recall, after the Second World War, well, most of Europe blown up, right? And that is when the age of empire faded for Europe, right? That is when the post-colonial time started, was when countries switched over to being democracies, right? Now there were countries, actually it's not on the map here, Spain and Portugal. Anyone know what the deal with Spain and Portugal was during the Second World War?
So Franco,
What's that?
dictator.
Yeah. So like we had Mussolini in Italy, and we had Hitler in Germany, we had Franco in Spain, Salazar in Portugal. They were fascists. They helped the Germans. They did all kinds of crazy stuff. Now, at the end of the Second World War, when we defeated fascism in Europe, nobody talks about Spain and Portugal because we just let them sit there. We didn't go after them. We didn't get rid of their dictators. Now, what did that mean? Well, that means that you had a police state in these countries. You had execution and torture of political dissent. You also had, let's talk,
Catalonia.
what's that?
Catalonia, Barcelona, that area where they kind of fought for their freedom, and they're still fighting for their freedom.
Yeah, but Portugal, let's just stick with Portugal for a second. Because they didn't have their decolonial time after the Second World War, they were still fighting wars in Africa, killing millions of people for decades, right? These countries stayed fascist and they stayed empires trying to take resources from the rest of the world by force. It wasn't until the 70s when these countries had internal revolutions. There were, it was interesting because I went to a museum on this recently when I was in Portugal, and they had an anti-fascist movement that had been going for years and years and years, and it wasn't successful until the 70s. And then when Portugal changed over their political leadership, the country changed overnight. They stopped their wars abroad, and they reached out to the countries that had been colonies, and they said, anyone who wants to move to Portugal, you're welcome. So if you go to Portugal, you have lots of Africans. More than 1 million Africans came to Portugal to live, and their descendants still live there today. So it was a big changeover that happened when fascist countries fall. It's a different attitude, I guess I would say. Okay, that's a huge tangent. All right. See, Berlin Wall fell. That's when the Warsaw Pact really was no longer a thing. This is the former border. I'm going to show you a little bit of Europe. This is a map. This chapter talks about the Berlin Wall being the big dividing line between East and West. Well, you can go to Berlin, which is a wonderful city these days. Most of the buildings and architecture are newer, though, because it was almost completely obliterated during the Second World War. this is just a map of where the wall used to be, and they have walks that you can do. And as you go along these walks, there'll be actual little things on the street. If you're walking around and you notice these things, these will actually list people who were executed during fascism, right? And these are all over the streets. There's places where the wall used to be. Most of the wall's been torn down. A bunch of the wall, it just kind of looks like this now. Just kind of a lot of graffiti. Or they'll have these metal things. And as you can see these pictures on the back, Berlin has a very strong sense of their own history. And they'll show you at different points along the wall when people were trying to escape. Different people were shot. Some people escaped. As you go through the city, there'll be slight little tiny remnants of giant buildings and structures that used to exist there. This is a Holocaust memorial. So we're running low on time. So what I'm gonna do, as always, gonna have you guys work on a couple of questions. Let's see here. I think I got them here somewhere. Alright. And we don't have, how many people we got today? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Alright. Let's do large groups. In large groups, right? 5 people to 8 people per group. So this could be very large groups. Work on these questions. They're pretty simple, but do try to be thorough. Lately, it seems students will read the beginning of a question and answer it, and then they'll give up on the end. But bring it on up when you're done. All right, self-assemble. Self-assemble, big groups, 5 to 8 per group.